Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Paige Knight, and I'm a research and policy analyst with New Mexico Voices for Children. And I, alongside Bill Jordan, our government relations officer at New Mexico Voices, are here to discuss policy solutions for investing in New Mexico's children and families. So when we were last together in August, Amber discussed our Kids Count program, where at the heart of the program and at the heart of our organization is the belief that all children should have the best possible opportunities to reach their full potential. And we know that our children have enormous potential, but the data shows that we as a state still have significant work to do when it comes to improving the economic well-being, the education, health, and safety of our communities for our children and families. An important part of that work involves public policy. We here all know that policy matters when it comes to improving childhood outcomes, and policies focused on family economic security are particularly important given the state of our economy due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So today I'm going to be talking first and foremost about the importance of family economic security, which is a critical foundation for healthy child development. Exposure to economic stress and hardship can take a toll on a child's physical and mental health, their educational achievement, and social emotional well-being. I'll also go over how our families are faring as a result of COVID-19 and the resulting economic downturn, and the long-standing inequities that have been exposed as a result. Then I'll hand it over to Bill to discuss what specific policies we can promote and advocate for to help us achieve a quick and more equitable recovery for all New Mexicans. So before the pandemic hit, New Mexico was moving forward on a path to prosperity, a path where we were really starting to create those opportunities for our kids and families to realize their potential. So in 2019 and 2020, policymakers took some really important steps to improve fairness in our tax code, and they made some much needed investments in the programs and services that matter most for families with kids. And even with the start of the pandemic, policymakers have also made common sense decisions to protect the health and safety of New Mexicans and to extend crucial relief to kids, families, and workers in need. But despite these efforts, we know that COVID-19 has created many challenges and financial stress for our families and our kids. In New Mexico, 51% of adults in households with children have lost employment income since March. At least 38,000 children were excluded from receiving a stimulus payment because a family member was an immigrant without documentation. As many as 34% of children are projected to be food insecure in 2020 as a result of COVID-19. And 23% of adults with children in the household have little or no confidence in their ability to pay their next rent or mortgage payment on time. But perhaps the most alarming aspect to the COVID-19 pandemic is how unequal the impact has been across lines of income, race, and gender, exposing long-standing systemic inequities in our society. So here's a chart that shows how lower income communities have a higher prevalence of COVID-19 infections. So on the far left, you can see that census tracts that have less than a 5% poverty rate have a prevalence of just over 200 for every 100,000 people. Now, as you move to the right, the poverty rate grows, and the prevalence increases dramatically. On the far right, you can see that for census tracts that have a poverty rate of 40% or more, the number of COVID-19 infections is over 2,000 for every 100,000 New Mexicans. And there are a number of reasons for this, and many of these show how public policy has fallen short and how it needs to be improved. For example, there are a lack of options available to low-wage essential workers to deal with the virus. Many lack access to unemployment benefits, paid sick or family leave, or health insurance. And these factors place low-wage workers and their families at higher risk of COVID-19 infection and transmission. This graph here shows COVID-19 infections by race. We have the proportion of COVID-19 infections in the blue bars compared to the proportion of New Mexico's population in green. Native Americans have been more vulnerable to the virus due to the legacies of colonialism, racism, and the federal government's failure to adequately support the well-being of these communities. You can see how disproportionate the rates are. In the past couple of weeks, Native Americans accounted for 28% of infections, and in the spring it was even higher, while only compromising 10% of New Mexico's population. The opposite trend is true for white New Mexicans. They account for only 15% of infections despite being 37% of New Mexico's population. And this is because workers who are more likely to be able to work from home, jobs that are also higher paying, are held by more white workers. Now, not only has the virus itself impacted lower income communities and communities of color more than wealthier, whiter communities, but the resulting recession has too. And there's also a stark gender difference. Last month, more women left the US labor force than the total number of jobs the country added. That's a rate that is four times higher for women than for men. Many women are leaving the workforce to care for children and to support the education of children at home with schools closed. Mothers have lost more wages, decreased work hours, and exited the labor force more than fathers since the pandemic began. Women also make up the majority of the workforce in fields that have been hardest hit by social distancing and the coronavirus, like retail and hospitality. And again, just like the virus itself, low-wage workers of color have been dealt the largest economic blow, while those at or near the top of the economic ladder have largely been unaffected. And many are still struggling to regain their unemployment. Not only has this been the most unequal recession in modern history, but these workers most impacted also have less savings to rely upon to help with the financial stress and uncertainty if they lose employment income, making these workers and their families more at risk for housing insecurity and food insecurity, in addition to economic insecurity. And when we see such blatant disparities in the health and economic consequences of this pandemic, we have to ask ourselves why, so we can determine what policy solutions there are. And while there are a multitude of factors we can point to, an enormous reason is racism's harmful legacy and ongoing damage for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Policy is not race neutral, and policy has not always been used to advance equity in New Mexico or in the United States. Too many past and current policies have held people of color back from the same opportunities as white individuals. As an example, I want to talk about the racial wealth divide, which is a big reason why we are seeing the disparities we are in health and economic security. So simply put, wealth is what you own minus what you owe. And the racial wealth gap is the difference in the net worth of white families and families of color. So in New Mexico, white households have on average a net worth of $133,000, while households of color have on average net worth of only $31,000. So why is having wealth important? Well, insufficient wealth means you're unable to purchase homes, to obtain high quality education without having to go into debt, unable to experience economic security, or to weather a crisis like the pandemic. Government policies and actions have reinforced and further widened racial wealth gaps, from slavery and Jim Crow laws, to the confiscation of tribal land and resources, to tax cuts that favor wealth over wages, and to redlining policies and the segregation of African Americans in lower value neighborhoods, coupled with the added difficulty of purchasing homes or starting businesses due to lending discrimination. And as a very recent example, take the federal Paycheck Protection Program that gave forgivable loans to small businesses impacted by COVID-19. Well, with the way it was designed, it was easiest for businesses to get a loan if they had an existing relationship with a traditional bank. Well, small business owners of color are more likely to be unbanked or underbanked, so accessing that money was much more difficult and time-consuming, meaning they were at greater risk of losing their business without that financial support, or they had to find other ways of accessing capital, often with high interest fees due to having less access to credit and capital to begin with. So this is what we mean when we say that no policy is race neutral, and why it's important that policy proposals have racial equity analyses so policies can be better designed, something that Bill is going to touch on along with other proposals to tackle wealth and income inequality. Now, before I hand it over to Bill to talk about policy solutions for the future, I want to talk about lessons we can learn from our past so that we can ensure that this time around we have equitable state spending that supports New Mexicans with the greatest health and economic needs. So in past economic downturns, we've handled revenue shortfalls by taking the misguided and harmful approach of austerity, cutting critical funding for many of the programs and services that help people recover and prosper in times of economic uncertainty. This stinginess has starved our healthcare system and schools of important funding and caused New Mexico to have one of the slowest economic recoveries from the Great Recession. We can't afford to let history repeat itself. But thankfully, economists agree on a better approach. So research shows that during a recession and a subsequent revenue shortfall, raising revenue versus cutting funding for critical public programs or giving tax cuts for those at the top is the best policy for a quicker, more equitable recovery. That's because public investments, not tax cuts, create jobs. No business can operate here or anywhere without a skilled and healthy workforce or customers with money to spend on local goods and services. These are created when we invest in our human capital, and that takes revenue. So now I'm going to hand it over to Bill to discuss how we can secure our state finances and advance anti-racist policies in New Mexico.
Thanks, Paige. When we talk about systemic racism, it's helpful to note that some policies are intentionally racist, like the redlining that Paige talked about, or more recently, the myriad of ways that are now being used to try to suppress the vote of Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans. But while most proposed policies are not intentionally racist, they may nevertheless impact various racial groups differently. I want to talk quickly about how we might begin to dismantle some of the structures of racism to be more intentionally anti-racist in developing New Mexico's budget, its tax system, and other laws. And more specifically, what Voices is proposing for the upcoming legislative session. Let's start by building a better budget. First, that's going to require more transparency in the legislative process, a laser focus on equity, and considerably more funding for education and healthcare. So here are just a few of our recommended budget changes. We need to increase funding for K-12 in a way that is consistent with the Yazzie Martinez court ruling. That's going to take significantly more revenue. And while we're at it, we should make sure that all of our kids and families have access to reliable and affordable broadband. We need to restore the deep cuts made to higher ed during the Great Recession and begin to build a world-class education system that helps our young people succeed without racking up a lot of student debt. So let's expand the lottery and opportunity scholarships to make college more affordable. If our families and businesses are going to recover from this current recession, we need to significantly increase funding for child care assistance. That's absolutely essential to our economic recovery and family economic security. We need to provide much more support to working parents and to an industry that is primarily run and staffed by women. We should expand the availability of not just childcare, but also home visiting and pre-K to all of our families across the state by passing a constitutional amendment that allows the state to use 1% of New Mexico's $20 billion land grant permanent fund for early education. We should maximize the benefits of the Affordable Care Act with additional outreach to enroll more eligible families, expand affordability measures so that families can get health care coverage, and use every opportunity to include coverage for immigrants. We need to boost funding for more affordable housing and increase unemployment insurance benefits for those struggling to find work. So if we're going to build a more equitable budget, it's going to require changes to our tax system that promote equity and raise more revenue. First, and perhaps most importantly, New Mexico could increase personal income taxes for the highest income earners. This chart shows the rate of state taxes paid by the richest New Mexicans on the far right and the lowest income families on the left. Whites are disproportionately represented by higher incomes and lower taxes on the far right, while families of color are overrepresented on the left side with lower incomes but higher taxes. We need to flip this graph so that those with higher incomes also pay a higher rate of taxes. New Mexico actually gives a 40% tax break to those who make their money from investments, while taxing those who work for their money at the full rate. We should be taxing wealth and income from investments at least as much as we're taxing the wages of workers. With regard to corporate income taxes, it turns out that in 2013, we cut the corporate tax rate so deeply, and we've given out so many tax credits that corporate income taxes now contribute $0 to the state budget. We need to repeal some or all of those corporate tax cuts. And because many big corporations pay nothing at all, we should enact a new minimum corporate tax. New Mexico has the lowest property taxes in the nation, so we could look to increase property taxes on high dollar properties while holding low and middle income families harmless from any increase. Families and businesses alike complain about New Mexico's regressive gross receipts tax, and it is getting high. We could lower the gross receipts tax, but only if we don't give out so many tax breaks. So let's repeal some of those tax breaks, and then we'd be able to lower the rate for everyone, families and small business. In addition to those tax changes, if we want to improve family economic security for those who need it most, we should look to significantly increase the low-income comprehensive tax rebate, the working families tax credit, and enact a new child tax credit. All three of those tax credits would improve racial equity in our tax system. So there are several other no-cost actions that lawmakers should take to improve racial equity. Here's a few that we believe would make a big difference. New Mexico finally needs to end predatory lending. The abuses of payday loans, car title loans, and tax refund loans are all targeted at low-income households. Ending those predatory practices would put hundreds of millions of dollars back into the pockets of families of color. We need to continue to raise New Mexico's minimum wage and work to repeal the lower minimum wage for tipped workers and continue the fight for equal pay for women. We need added protections for all of our essential workers. The legislature should mandate paid sick leave, family medical leave, and always protect workers' right to organize. We need to protect voting rights by making it easier to vote, not harder. Another initiative that we think is important is for the legislature to require a racial impact analysis of all legislation. If our examination of systemic racism is to be real, then we should never debate a bill without asking, how does this legislation impact various racial and ethnic groups? If we truly want to be anti-racist, then we should not be debating legislation without knowing the racial impacts. When decisions are made by politicians who are oblivious to the racial impacts of their actions, it's likely to result in decisions that uphold the current systems of oppression. We should never again be able to say that we didn't know better. If we know better, I believe we'll do better. I'm not sure I'd say that about every state, but I believe that about New Mexico. When we all know better, we will choose what is right and just for all of us. So before I wrap up, I just want to mention a few things that we hope Congress will pass. These include a boost in funding for Medicaid, for SNAP, the food stamp program, for unemployment insurance for our unemployed workers, childcare so that parents can get back to work, additional education funding, and they should look to expand the federal earned income tax credit and the federal child tax credit. All of these actions would advance racial equity and provide much needed help to struggling families in New Mexico and across the nation. Finally, I want to ask all of you to take action. Halloween is coming up in a couple of weeks, but there's something even scarier happening right after that. Don't be scared. Don't let fear or anything else stop you from taking action. It makes a big difference when candidates and lawmakers hear from the voters. So I want to encourage all of you to contact your lawmakers often. Engage with them about the issues that you are most passionate about, and ask them to consider racial equity in all of their policy decisions. New Mexico is on a path to recovery. We're going through some tough times right now, but let's make sure that this time our recovery doesn't leave anyone behind. We're in this together. It's not enough to say we won't make the same mistakes again. We need to also make up for past inequities, to right the wrongs of institutional racism, to dismantle the structures of oppression and injustice, to be anti-racist, and to make equity a focus of our budget, our tax policies, and our laws. Starting in January, we have an extraordinary opportunity in front of us. With a new legislature and a new Congress, let's make sure we bring everyone along that path to greater opportunity built on racial equity. Thank you.